everybody. Welcome back. Well, we have a very special guest and a very special week. And we decided to call this Where is God Week. Now, it's obviously no surprise that Tan and I are, devout Christians, and we've talked about that before, and I helped to create the Daniel Plan. And we've had really some amazing guests. But we have Pastor Dr. Rice Broocks with us, who is the author of God's Not Dead, which then turned into a blockbuster movie, which we saw, which was
It's amazing.
Yeah. He is the pastor at Bethel Church in Nashville, and Every Nation. He's also creator of Every Nation.
Just one of the co-founders.
One of the co-founders, which has churches in 80 countries, you said?
About that, yeah.
Wow.
But your first love was actually working with young people.
Well, I'm still the world's oldest living teenager, so I'm out on campus. I'm out primarily on campus, which is a lot of what we do in our church movement is we plant churches that target campus communities. So like 2 weeks ago, I was in Poland, right there near the campus. Last week, Indiana University. So I'm taking this message in a multimedia fashion to the campuses, and then from there, good things happen.
Well, and that
So you
makes
really have
sense
to
because
take
the
care of
movie
your-
sort of was fashioned
Was
around
it?
that, and it
Yes.
made that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
And you have to take care of your brain, because if you're on that many planes, there's a whole bunch of toxins going along.
That's
with
why I'm
that.
here. I
We
came
are
to you
going
for
to
that.
teach you
I
how to
am here for that, so,
detoxify
yeah, this is
your
definitely-
brain, because you have a big mission.
Yeah.
Then most people don't really ever think about their
Now, I
brain.
read that on one of your books. You talked about the danger of airplane flight. I thought I've done almost 3 million miles in a plane. I have passed that. That is already whatever you can do to unravel 3 million miles of
Yeah.
air travel.
We are definitely going to do it because God created your brain to heal. There's this whole thing called neuroplasticity, that if you put your brain in a healing environment, it can be a whole bunch better. So that is our
That's
goal.
so
So,
good.
in addition to the author of God's Not Dead, Man, Myth, Messiah, the evidence behind God's Not Dead 2, which we saw and loved, and The Human Right to Know Jesus Christ and to Make Him Known. So
That was connected to the third one. So
Right.
it'll just keep going.
Isn't
Like
there
So
another one coming
why
up?
did
It'll
you
already
get?
happened, and it's going to be like Fast and Furious or Rocky.
Right,
It
'cause
will
there's
just
another
keep
one.
going. Yeah, it's already happened.
So
Yeah, okay.
we are going to talk about where is God, and because this is like a seriously crazy time. Although I'm always
It
reminded
feels
whenever I
scary.
say that, I remember when I was 6 years old and I was in Catholic school. We had 48 students in a class, right? 6 rows, 8 deep. And we had nuclear war drills, right? If the
Cuban Missile
sirens go
Crisis,
off,
yes.
it's like get under your desk. So,
The part that feels scary to me, though, is how we're turning on each other. It feels unsafe to me now because the hatred amongst us as a country where we used to have similar values, and even though there were differences, there was some level of respect. There's none now.
So before
None.
we get into that, what I want, just so I want the listeners to, I want them to really know Pastor Broocks' heart. Why did you write God's Not Dead?
Okay, great question, and I'll try to make it short. Well, my story is not very exciting as in terms of how I came to faith. I was just a guy that needed God. But my atheist brother was in law school at SMU in Dallas, and he came home to talk me out of my faith one weekend. So he started studying the Bible to find the contradictions. So the weekend that he came home to talk me out of my faith, we baptized him.
Oh, wow.
And when he came up out of the water,
Whoops.
he said, "You haven't really answered all my questions, but I think I've been asking the wrong questions." So what I did was I pulled a thread that kind of unraveled his worldview. Many times people have all these questions for God, but maybe he has one for you. So my entire family, my dad was in the oil business. After my dad kind of figured that I needed some kind of help. So if it's God, great. But when my brother came to faith, that was earth shaking. My entire family came to faith. My dad at 57. And so, in fact, my dad said, I prayed for a miracle all my life and I never thought I'd see one, but I think he's shown me one. God has shown it to me in the form of my two sons. And he said, I don't know much about God, but I got down on my knees, he told my mom, and asked Jesus Christ to forgive me for my pride and my arrogance. So my family was revolutionized. So from there, I graduated with, I was an accounting major. I went to see that same miracle happen with other kids, other students. So I started traveling the campuses of the world. And anyway, cut to the movie. Basically, right after 9/11, this ties into the Where's God? Because right after 9/11, there was a rise of what was called the New Atheism. You had men like Richard Dawkins, who's a biologist, Sam Harris, who's a neuroscientist out of LA out here, and then others that came along. Christopher Hitchens, a very eloquent atheist. He passed away a couple of years ago. But basically, they began to write books saying religion is the problem. So with that was this almost immediate reaction of, as these books were written, then there was this massive fallout away from the faith. In fact, some studies said that 7 out of 10 young people will leave high school with a faith of some kind. When they get to the university, then they'll lose it. And the reason why is because they don't have anything beyond a subjective experience.
Right.
They felt something in the youth group or whatever, but yet when they get into the atmosphere of arguments where it's not your subjective experience that's on the line, is do you have anything that's true? Is there any evidence? In writing this book, I went to the Global Atheist Convention, which was in Melbourne, Australia, the largest indoor gathering of atheists in history. And the refrain was that basically faith is just blind. If you believe something, you pull the blinds down, you close your eyes, put your fingers in your ears, and that's how you come to your, quote, faith. So I started writing this book. I have some friends that are a singing group called the Newsboys, and they rolled up into my driveway
great.
one day, and the lead singer lived across the street, but they rolled up in the driveway and said, hey, we got this new song, and what do you think? I said, let's give them more than just a song. Let's give the reasons. Let's give them evidence. And so then I was writing the book, and I was literally driving down the road with a friend who's a businessman. I said, I'm writing this book. I told him why. And he said, that needs to be a movie. So he brought the movie company to me. We came here to LA. They followed me around UCLA, and we had conversations and met with the screenwriters. And we just kind of thought it would be a nice little movie. And it ended up, minimally what it did was it shattered records. And the Rotten Tomatoes didn't like it.
Right,
But
of course
beyond
not.
that,
Of course not.
the box office liked it, and it's gone all over the world. So that was way more than you asked for, but that
Yes,
was
37,000 reviews on IMDb.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, and it was quite a shock to see the response.
So thoughtful. I actually loved the part toward the end where they talked about Stephen Hawking's argument against God.
Yeah.
And they actually buried him in Westminster Abbey. Yeah. It shocked me. I'm like, Stephen Hawking's buried in Westminster Abbey, one of the most beautiful
You're
churches
going to end up in
world.
church regardless of your beliefs.
Either way.
I mean, all due respect to him, obviously, he was none like him in terms of his intellect.
Right.
So I don't want to say anything negative about that. But yeah, Hawking, basically what Hawking said was, he said, because there's a law like gravity, this was in his last book, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Well, wait a minute, I'll quote John Lennox, who's a mathematician from Oxford and a philosopher. He said, that's a contradiction. If there's nothing, then gravity is not nothing. So you either have an eternal law like gravity that's just self-existent, that's there, or you have an eternal lawgiver. Both the atheist and the theist has to posit something that didn't start. So when somebody says, who made God? Well, okay, fair question, but yet you either have a physical reason for the physical universe, or you have a non-physical reason. And the evidence is the universe had a beginning, that space, time, and matter had an absolute beginning 13.7 billion years ago at the Big Bang. So if space and time had a beginning, then the cause must necessarily be spaceless, timeless, obviously uncaused, powerful, and ultimately personal, because to go from nothing, which is what rocks dream about, I mean, that's nothing, to something, then obviously that was volitional. There was a decision being made. So it's sad that a man could be so brilliant in terms of breaking down the physical universe. But just because you know how an iPhone works doesn't mean Steve Jobs never existed. I mean, when you're looking for God, I'm asking people, what evidence do you want? Well, they're looking for something physical. Well, God's not physical. The architect of this building is not in the walls. So what we're looking for is the evidence for an intelligent mind. But anyway, once you get to the fact that God exists, then you get into these questions that you're bringing up about, well, if he is there and the evidence shows he is, then why this? So I'll go back to your initial theme of why.
Well, I wanted people to get to know you, and they are a little bit. When we come back, we're actually going to attack this question, where is God? Stay with us.
I will embrace my many strengths.
I will not be tormented by my past.
I will find the right balance.
I will be calm and courageous.
I will be free. I am not just bipolar.
I am not just autism.
I'm not just depression.
I'm not just ADD.
I am not just anxiety.
I am not just OCD.
I am not just PTSD.
Welcome back. So we are still here with our friend, Dr. Rice Broocks, and he's the author of God's Not Dead. We're having an amazing time talking to him. He's so brilliant. And we want to go after this question this week of where is God? So sometimes it feels to me like what are we doing? Like as a society, as a country, as a people, what's going on? I mean, where is God, right? And I want you to touch on that. So where is God when it hurts? Where is God when the world feels crazy? Where is God, for people who don't believe?
Yeah. Well,
Or even for people who do
Who-
believe.
yeah, sometimes
It's-
we,
it's like, how does
sometimes
this
we feel
make
like, how
sense?
does this
You
make
know,
sense?
the
when I hear that
insanity.
question, and again, we take the message of God's Not Dead, and I travel to campuses around the world and do a multimedia presentation, and students come. At the end, we have Q&A. I normally have a physicist, which I highly recommend traveling with a physicist. It's like, it's good to have that as a backup guy, But anyway, but eventually, beyond the scientific arguments or the philosophical arguments, it comes down to this question of why would God allow evil? If there is a God, then why would God allow such acts to happen? And so the first thing I do is, as a pastor, I stop and I want to know, is this personal? Is this something, has something happened to you? Because I don't want to be glib or give some philosophical answer. If you lost your family or you've had some tragedy, it's like when you hear, or you want to first of all know what trauma is going on here that has caused this kind of reaction. But many times you get to, it's more of a theoretical question. People are mainly using that argument, not because they've personally suffered, but because they've got this thought that maybe this proves that God doesn't exist because there's evil. And now the short answer is simply this, and since we're I'll do the fast break Los Angeles Laker offense here. If there is no God, there is no evil. You see, if we're
I like that.
in other words, you can't even explain the world we live in without borrowing the biblical terms to make sense of it. In other words, if we're just animals, then when animals kill other animals, it's not a crime scene.
Right.
It's like Geico. It's just what animals do.
Right.
That's just what they do. And so why is it that in all of existence, here are these agents, humans, that are distinct. We have the ability to think, to not only think, but to think about thinking, metacognition. We can think about our thinking. And we've been given this ability to make a choice. So unlike an animal, which kind of acts out according to their DNA, I mean, if we're just acting out according to our DNA, then you wouldn't be morally responsible for that. That's just who we are, like we said. But because we are created in God's image, and we have choices to make. So there is a choice. So what you see in the world today are people acting out their choices. Now, God said, don't do it. God has said, God's against evil. He he came to earth as a man in Christ to deal with it personally. So no one encountered the evil to deal with it and then ultimately was the victim of it than Christ.
Yeah.
So this is not a distant God sitting up like in Mount Olympus,
No.
casually looking over the banisters of eternity to kind of see how his lab experiment.
Well, it reminds me of a really good parent when you like. For those of us who do believe, we sort of have a spoiler alert of why all this is happening. But without even
Well
aside
said,
from that,
well
right? Aside from that, when I look at the scripture, it's like reminds me of a good parent. It's like I'm not going to tell you can't do it, but if you do it, these are the consequences.
Right.
Well, but some of the people listening have been molested. So, as a psychiatrist
I can relate
and a
to that.
child psychiatrist, some people listening have really experienced
Trauma.
evil.
Yeah, evil.
And
I'm one of
awful
those people.
things happen to them. And the question comes, if there's a loving God, why did he allow that
I think
to
what I-
happen? Or I have a granddaughter who is handicapped, and she's born with a very rare genetic deletion, and even at the age of 7, she's still not talking, and she had wicked seizures. And so, many people go, if there is divine creation, that's not divine.
So if I'm understanding you
I'll pick that up.
to sort of boil down what you're saying is without pain we can't know joy. It's almost like what you're saying. I mean, way more intensely, way more in depth. You're saying if there were no evil, there would be no God. I mean, to some extent, we're almost saying without one, there's not the other.
C.S. Lewis would say this: I know a line is crooked, but how do I know what a crooked line is?
If I don't
unless
know what
knew
a straight
line
that's
is?
what I'm trying to say.
So I'll try to make a simple statement. The existence of evil doesn't point to the absence of God from the world, but from his absence from our lives. So here is God is basically, his word is clear about the things that you would say are evil, to not do that. The punishment that we will ultimately stand and account for. So whoever committed something is not getting away with it. Maybe they think they get away with it in this life, but there will be an accountability. And that's kind of hard for some people to get their head around, but the bottom line is that one day we will all stand before the ultimate audit, if you will. If you're an IRS audit, well, guess what? There's one coming.
Right.
So I think that the fact that there is this, the real reason is what's wrong with us. When writing this book, I was in the home of a man named Francis Collins, and Dr. Collins was he's the head of the NIH, or has been, and was the head of the Human Genome Project. He kind of broke down the DNA molecule and taught us how to read it. So within the human molecule, within the DNA is this long sentence. I mean, really, it's 3 billion letters long, the information inside of us. If you got a text from somebody that you knew they sat on their phone, you know that they could never do a pocket text and do a complete sentence. What about 13 billion letters long? So when you know as a scientist and as a doctor that genetic code, that the environment, that choices, other people's choices can actually have an impact on our genes.
Mm-hmm.
That correct if my science gets off, because you're the scientist, I'm not. But so we are living in a world that's been damaged by evil. You scanned my brain today, and I'd had a car accident, and you knew it. I could have not told you that, and you could have said something happened.
I would have known
Well, if you scan the soul, there's something wrong. This proclivity, this brokenness inside of us. 2010, the largest oil disaster in American history, the BP oil disaster out off the Gulf of Mexico, 200,000 gallons of oil dumping into the Gulf for 89 straight days. Now, you could try to clean up the mess, but ultimately you had to stop evil. You had to stop, I'm giving my punchline away, you had to stop the thing at its source. And this is what the gospel says. The gospel says that God didn't stay at a distance, but became a man in Christ. He lived the life we should have lived, meaning he lived morally perfect, broke religious laws, but never broke the moral law. He died the death we should have died in our place. 3 days later, he rose from the dead, which that gave the validation of who he is. A lot of people, I met 2 people at Berkeley, California out there, and one day they told me, one said he was Moses, the other said he was Jesus. Now, I met a woman on the plane that told me she was God, and I looked at her and said, if you're God, I got a lot of questions for you. So just claiming you're God doesn't make you God. So Jesus' claims could have just been like one of those I mentioned, but his resurrection validated it. But what the gospel, the good news of Christianity is that the gospel can go to that source of evil within the human heart and deal with evil and injustice at its source. That's why atheism doesn't take away the pain. When people react to pain with skepticism, or I'm going to just say goodbye to God, I say atheism doesn't take away the pain. It just takes away the hope. Or one woman who had seen
Say
both.
that again.
I like that.
Atheism doesn't take away the pain.
It just takes away the hope.
It just takes away the hope.
So
That's powerful.
I had I know I hate to rush. I feel myself rushing because I know the shortness of time. But I interviewed a woman on Christian television who the next day, Dr. Phil did, who had seen both of her parents shot, and both eventually died. One died on the spot, the other died later. The man was put away, got out in 20 years. But 20 years after basically a double murder, he's released. And this woman gave him a Bible. And can you imagine, you see as like a 7-year-old your parents shot in front of you. You identify the murderer, the assailant. And she
That's
said to me,
horrible.
she said, I was mad at God. She said, but I needed God more than I needed to be mad at him. So when we look at a world with pain, when we look at people that do bad things, God's not the one that did it. God's the one that's not only saying don't do it. There's so many, in fact, the fact that things get exposed, the fact that we can be healed. It's like when you looked at me and said, hey, you've had a brain injury here through your wreck, but I got good news for you. You can get better. I mean, there's no better sound than someone saying you can get well. And that's really what Jesus said, you can be well. I'm not the author of that. That was not my will, but I have come to give you hope and to give you healing. So I hope it
was great.
Where is God? Stay with us. We're going to explore this further. Welcome back. Tan and I are with Pastor Rice Brooks. We're having such an interesting
Yeah,
discussion. And we are in Where is God Week?
Right.
And, every book I've signed for the last 30 years, I always sign it with hope. Because that's what our work does, is you can be better and I can prove it. And that's really what I felt when I've watched the God's Not Dead movies, is that there's transformation and hope. And you've been doing this for a long time. What keeps you inspired every day to know where God is?
Gosh, let me ponder that. That's a great question. Little story. After 9/11, the day after 9/11, I drove to New York from Nashville. I just was watching the buildings and go down, and I just couldn't stay home. So I start driving. I thought surely my wife would tell me no, but she said, I think you should go. So we drive all night, get there on the 13th of September. And as I was leaving the house there in Nashville, I had this thought to call someone in the media, in a local NBC anchor in our local affiliate there in Nashville. And she answered in 10:30 at night. And I said, do you know anybody in the New York media? She said, I've got one name. Let me make sure I get a number. Well, the name she gave me was her name was Alice Ree. Alice was a producer for MSNBC. And when we got there 2 days after 9/11, at night, as close as we could get to the ground zero, it was called the Armory, and everybody had their pictures up of missing. If you remember those images of people saying, my friend is missing, and they had these little makeshift posters, but there was really not much hope. But they were just to the last, till they knew that their loved ones were definitely gone. They were going to fight for them and try to find them. Well, Alice Ree looked at me. Here she is, and she stared at me. She said, "What are you doing here?" Had 3 other pastors, and she said, "I was at Columbine covering that," and says, "Here you guys show up." She said, "I just prayed. God, if you're here, if you're real, why are you letting this happen? And she says, I was just, in her own words, basically about to give up on God, and you guys show up. So I go back to Nashville on the Sunday after 9/11, and I stood up in our church and I said, I don't know how we're going to do it, but we're going to plant a congregation in New York. And a guy comes out of the crowd. He said, I have a theater right on Times Square. You can use it.
Wow.
So if you know Times Square, it's where the ABC corner is, and there was Toys R Us was there.
Yeah.
I mean, just a few feet up was the Lambs Theater, and this guy was affiliated with it. So within 1 month, I would do my 3 services in Nashville and jump in a plane and speak in New York City. I did that for an entire year.
Wow.
She ended up finding our church and became a part of it. But I sat there Sunday night after Sunday night in New York City, 1 month after 9/11. Quite the contrast to the Nashville Bible Belt crowd, and had to hear the stories of people that had lost someone and that very question of where was God. I wrote a little book called Finding Faith at Ground Zero. And Larry King actually mentioned on the air, but I just wrote it as 5 little chapters. We just gave it all over the city. And that was the first chapter, Where Was God? And I think what inspires me is to see that moment where people who could easily have turned from God, and as you just mentioned about hope, they just suddenly something hits them that this is not God that did that. God is the one that's the solution. He's not the problem.
So God did not create the Holocaust. God hated 9/11.
Hated 9/11.
But
So-
if you don't have choice, then you don't have free will.
Well, and we live in a world right now where there's just, we were talking before we started, there's so much vitriol, there's so much hatred, and there's just so much hatred toward all religions, not just Christianity, not just Muslims, not just Jews. It's like there are people from every walk of life who hate every other religion, and as a Christian, that makes me sad, because we have people who watch us from all over the world. I have friends who are Muslim, I have friends who are Jewish, I have
Right.
friends who are... How can we get to a place where we can believe what we believe and respect, I respect my friends. Why can't we do this with people from around the world? What will it take to be able to believe what we believe and be able to have a respectful conversation about this?
Yeah, 2 parts to that, and I'll try to be brief and amazing. First of all, Christianity is true. The reason I'm a Christian is because it's true. So when a parent says to me, well, I don't want to force my religion down my children's throat, which I don't believe in, but I say, well, but you don't say that about the multiplication tables. And the reason why is because you believe they're true. You're not quite sure about this. It's almost like Christianity or whatever your religion is, it's like your culture. It's like, USC versus UCLA. It's really more of an emotional allegiance rather than what's true. So if you really come, first of all, to believe that Christianity is true, God really exists, He really sent His Son who really lived in history, He really died on a cross and rose again in history. So out of the confidence of that, then you say, well, now as a Christian, what am I commanded to be like? So the first thing you're supposed to do is love your neighbor.
Right.
So,
Right.
I mean, love God, love your neighbor.
Hello.
Hello, so, or as my kids like, love your neighbor or something, they always put or something.
Or something,
Not
yeah.
all of my kids, they'll be watching this. But so as I lived in Israel, studied in Israel, I do programs where I brought, then the ambassador, Danny Ayalon from Israel to the United States. He came to our church. Ron Dermer, the current Israeli ambassador, he's been in my home there in Nashville. And so we're building bridges between Christians and Jews and the Jewish community. And when they say to me, well, why are you doing this? I'm saying, look, I'm not here because I'm a good guy. I'm not a good guy apart from God. God changed me in college. So now He has commanded me to love my neighbors. So I'm really commanded to love you. That doesn't mean I'm loving you to try to convert you. Now, I'd like you to believe
Right.
what I'm saying is true. I lived in Algeria. My dad drilled oil wells in the Sahara Desert. So I lived in Algiers, which is it's a beautiful city. Obviously, very Muslim now, and most part militant. But yet we can go into people of other faiths and other beliefs confident that what we have is called public truth. It's a statement made by, I won't mention his name, but he's a legendary theologian who came back from India to England and saw that Christianity in the 70s was kind of receding in England. And he said, the reason why is, he said, because people see their faith as private truth, not public truth. He said, because the gospel happened in history, it's public truth. So we come into the public square to present our gospel, our truth, but we do it with, 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be ready to give a reason for the hope that's within you. And people love to quote that, but there's another part, with gentleness and
Yes.
respect. And so it's important, as important as it is to teach somebody the truth of Christianity, it's the way it's presented. I was getting my coffee one day, and this guy doing my coffee reached down and he grabbed my cup and handed me my coffee like this with his fingers, like I was at a nail, like I was getting my fingernails done, you know.
Oh, that's so
and
funny.
it's like, and his hands didn't need a manicure, and I just looked at him and I said, "We're going to start all over. We're going to start." It was real kind. And I think a lot of times we give people the gospel, but
Yeah.
our presentation is so off that people are repulsed by the demeanor that we have. And I think when you start, I teach a little principle called SALT. You start a conversation, you ask questions, you listen, and then you tell the story. So don't start, and the other version is the talk method. You
I
start
agree.
talking, you argue, you get louder, and then you kick them. So I think if you will listen respectfully to people, then they will in turn listen to you. So we can exchange our beliefs, make our claims for truth, but then trust that the truth of our message will win, not the emotion or the anger. It's like when you're married. I always said in marriage seminars, you know, the more right my wife is, the louder I get. You know, in other words, it's like, hey, she's really got me mad.
Right.
And so sometimes we have to realize that when someone's right, we don't. If I'm right, I don't have to be angry. If I'm not right, I can't afford to be.
Right, that's a good point.
So it's like in either case,
I like that.
in either case, the best thing is if you keep your cool, if you tell the truth and don't have to have the last word. I think that wins the day. And I think I did an event at, remember Rosie Greer? Remember Rosie?
Yeah.
I know Rosie's one of our players.
Well, you tell Rosie hello, but Rosie, when he had a moment of faith back in 1980, came to Christ, he traveled with me for about 3 years. So it was Rice and Rosie on campuses.
Cute.
And anyway, so but Rosie basically would I'm with a brain surgeon or a brain doctor, and I'm forgetting why I brought it up. See, so now you're diagnosing me on camera. You forgot what you were saying, right? But I think the point they're saying is that he, everywhere we would go with Rosie, he would make the point to people that it was the kindness of God that led, it was kindness. It was, it says Romans 2:4, the kindness of God leads you to repentance.
And that's the thing that I noticed today, whether it's religion or politics or whatever's going on, people are just so hateful. How are you ever going to hear what someone is saying?
So go through
With that
SALT.
hatefulness.
SALT again is
You start a conversation, you ask questions, you listen, and then you talk. Then
so
you tell the
that's
story.
not what's happening
No.
in our society. And people don't know. It's really insidious. News channels purposefully lead with negativity and hatred because that's actually what pushes on the nucleus accumbens, which we talk about, and it drives fear, which then draws viewers. And we are being sabotaged if we allow that to happen. Stay with us. I have a question you have to answer.
Welcome back. We are having the best conversation with Dr. Rice Brooks, the author of God's Not Dead. And we're going to talk about something a little sticky in this
Okay.
one, if we can continue this week of where is God in this world that is a little crazy right now. You brought up something earlier, and I want to continue with that, and it's going to get a little touchy. So a lot of people who listen to us have been hurt. I mean, like really hurt, traumatized. And I actually had a pretty traumatic childhood myself. I had a father who was a minister who, my dad was very far from the perfect minister. Let me just start with that. And he was not a part of my life growing up. So that'll give you some idea. And then just a lot of drama growing up with my mom. Now, personally, I can tell you where God was when I was growing up and there was a lot of trauma and drama. He wasn't there. That was the problem. So for me, that was the problem. So personally, my life was full of chaos and drama and trauma until I figured that part out, until I made peace with God
Until
and I
you
allowed God
invited
back
him
into my life.
in your life.
Then there was purpose, then there was hope, and then there was healing. But not everybody's there that listens to us. Not everybody feels that way, and they don't understand. And so what do we say to people who have experienced that kind of trauma and pain, and even far worse
where
than I
maybe
have?
even the church hurt them.
And that was my case.
And
That was
so I grew up Roman Catholic. My mother was not kidding about that. And I went to Catholic school, but I'm completely horrified by the sex abuse scandal in the church, and it's not just that. Is someone who's treated a lot of people who grew up in what really is abusive church families. When you hear that, what goes through your head, and how do you counsel people?
Yeah.
Because I know this isn't new for you.
No. And the first thing is always to listen to the people's individual stories. So rather than just generically, when I'm asked this, each person has a story. Each person's life was dramatically affected. And if they were negatively affected in the name of God or by somebody representing God, the highest condemnations of
Yes.
Jesus, the highest. When people talk about hell and why would God send people to hell, I said, well, just to be specific, Jesus really talks specifically about hell to religious people because who they were and what they represented had such an impact.
Yes.
The New Testament says, let not many of you become teachers, for there's a stricter judgment. In a short way, just because somebody claims to believe in God, I mean, I believe in the police and I believe in the speed limit, but that doesn't mean I'll slow down. So just because
That's a
somebody,
really good point.
just because somebody claims they believe in God and even claims that they know what God's instructions are, just makes them more culpable, not necessarily more prone to do it. That's why atheists can be good. When somebody says to me, are you saying atheists are bad? No, atheists can be good. They do good things. Why can an atheist be good and a religious person be bad? Because we're both made in God's image. So there's a moral code written on the inside of us. Romans chapter 2. Romans 1 says that the evidence of God is everywhere in creation. But then Romans 2 says that the conscience bears witness to the fact that moral law is within us. So even though you don't know where it comes from or you can account for it, you still can act morally. But even more so, if you know where it comes from and you know there's a source to it to perpetrate an act against a child. I mean, Jesus said, if you hurt one of these little ones, it would be better than a millstone tied around your neck. So the strongest condemnations are for those that would hurt somebody. The strongest judgments come for those that misguide people and if you represent God, to steer them off or to get them to where now they hate God because of what you did and they thought you were a believer or thought you were a representative of God.
So if I really want to get Tana going, there has to be a neuroscience part of this discussion.
Right.
Because, we have a database of 150,000 scans now. And part of our database, we have about 1,000 convicted felons, including 100 murderers.
Oh, and we could not agree on this. We still don't a lot.
I actually had no opinion on the death penalty
I do.
until attorneys started sending me people who did seriously bad things. And when you see their brains, not always, but most of the time, they're severely damaged brains. And then I'm like, it is not the sign of an evolved society to be killing sick people. And so I've been in court on death penalty cases, and ultimately I realized that's why in the Bible it says multiple times not to judge, because it's complicated, right? Behavior is complicated. And just because you have a bad brain doesn't mean you're going to do something bad, right? It's complicated. There's spiritual factors, there's psychological factors, there's social factors. But my work has softened my heart. And what I get horrified by is often they have brains that could be better. And, that's what I believe God put me on earth to do was the mission I'm here to do.
God and I are still working out my.
Let me respond to that, but I want to make. I don't want to
God and I are
I don't
still
wanna interrupt you.
wrestling.
I'll
If someone hurts
we'll
my
let you get to-
child,
okay, yeah.
jail's the only place.
So-
On
safe.
this, but
So
I want to
we have
respond
had-
to this.
Nope,
and then I'll,
not gonna
I'll
happen.
do it quickly, and then I know you
Not
have
happening.
something to say.
We've having none of it.
We've had many discussions.
Yeah.
on-
No, and it actually talks about not judging individually. If I'm correct, it says that as a society, our laws are made to be.
The wrong,
One
there's
look into
wrong. It's
this.
kind of like cholesterol. There's good and bad. There's good and bad judgment. We're to judge with righteous judgment.
Yes,
Now,
thank
judging
you.
something is
And they're to pay for them.
judging something is like the guy that sees a woman on the bus and her kids are unruly and he's going, that woman's terrible.
That's
She's
personal
not.
judgment,
And then all
right.
of a sudden he finds out, he corrects, he can't take it anymore to, hey, get your kids under. And he says, and the woman says, I'm sorry, I just lost my husband.
Yes.
So here's a woman who's just come from seeing her husband die, and she's on the bus. And so you judged based not on the full facts. But, there is an entire book of the Bible called Judges, so it's not necessarily a bad thing. And there will be eternal judgment, as it says in Hebrews 6, that one of the basic doctrines is eternal judgment. So I think and I'm not going to intrude on your area of expertise because I think that there's always case-by-case things. That's why a good judge will listen to every case. When somebody asks me, is God going to give a blanket pass to this group of people in eternity? Oh, y'all go to heaven. You got the stamp on your hand. You said the right words. So wait, the judgment, because God is eternal, He has an infinite amount of moments to listen to every detail and every word of your life. It says we will, Matthew 12, stand and account for every idle word. So God has an eternity to each individual that's ever lived to stand before Him and to go through every second of our life and why it happened. So ultimately, I think that there is a righteous judgment. I think there are factors that have to be dealt with individually. So back to the earth, not to eternity, back to the databases and the brains. I think that's why we have to bring every fact to bear. Now, I think as a whole, I don't think a person who commits some crazy act, though, did that all in one day. In other words, there's probably a pattern of other things that led to that. So when it comes to, I think if a person is mentally ill, then obviously then they should be given that consideration. In general, the general principle, though, is that there's the strongest judgments. And for somebody to hurt a child, that's obviously, God's not behind that, and God will deal with it. And that's why I think think about the mercy of God that all this is coming to light.
But we can't help out a little until that time. Till
Well-
God takes
well,
over.
we're not
So
not
let's
called-
talk about
that's what
James
the-
Holmes, who was the Batman shooter.
Yeah, no, it's okay. That one actually makes me cringe. I'm not totally without.
Empathy.
No.
The whole imaging stuff for me, it just gave me pause.
Yeah.
And I admit it did me too.
Pause and purpose. So for those of you that haven't seen the Facebook talk I did at Saddleback Church, it's now got nearly 40 million views. And I tell my passion story. And my nephew, when he was 9 years old, attacked a little girl on the baseball field for no reason, out of the blue. He was drawing pictures of himself shooting other children and hanging from a tree.
9.
He's Columbine or Aurora or Sandy Hook waiting to happen. And it ended up he had a cyst the size of a golf ball occupying this space. Easy to call him bad, hard to go, why? And, and my faith has always been the same. It's, there's complex reasons for behavior, and I'm not the judge.
And isn't this hopeful, though, you think about it, that people that, like, I think it was Garfield who was shot, and he didn't die from the assassin's bullet because of his physician's dirty hands that operated on him.
Yeah, interesting, right?
Yeah, so here we are, we're learning so much. And imagine being able to get brain health early on, so that the person
That's the hope.
never gets to the point
See,
of doing what
that's
he did
why
or
I
she
love what
did.
we do.
Yeah, because we're getting better, and I think that's why collectively I think if I look back 200 years ago, 300 years ago, I mean, the world was a pretty crazy place in the Middle Ages. I mean, even though it seems bad to us, a lot going on, I think collectively as a society, there's a overall globally, from poverty to sicknesses being eradicated to, I think it doesn't seem like it because we tend to judge
Focus
things
on the
on the
negative.
immediate moment. But I think that there's such an understanding coming, and there's so much insight into our DNA, into brain scans, into how do we operate in civility with other religions? That's possible. That's not a pipe dream. That's not a distant dream. I think there are massive areas and massive examples that we could go into if we had the time of where the good is taking place. The problem is the bad news sells. That gets
Where
amplified.
you bring your attention determines how you feel. Thank you so much. This has
was a
just
joy.
been
Thank you both.
amazing.
This was
How
Fantastic.
can people learn more about your work, your church? I mean, obviously they can go online and get God's Not Dead.
You were showing
or
me an
the
app
Human
earlier
Right.
that was really cool too.
Yeah, they can just download. There's a God's Not Dead app. That's one thing. RiceBrooks.com. That's kind of a central location where it can
And
get
your last name is spelled a little funky.
Yeah, thank you. I've been explaining that, but the rice is even more of
I
a need
want
of
to
an
know.
explanation.
We're going to have dinner later, so I wanted you to tell me that.
Well, that was Rice University. That was actually my relative was the one that founded that, but that didn't do me any good when I'm growing up. I played basketball in high school, and I got to play 1 minute, so they called me Minute Rice. I would come in at the end.
So funny.
So yeah, so when I speak to
hilarious.
sports teams, I'm always quick to say, look, it has nothing to do with my athletic
That
background.
is
I
so
was
funny.
Minute Rice. So.
Minute Rice.
But
So
yeah,
his last
so
name is
RiceBrooks.com. and they can-
BROOCKS.
Yeah.
God's Not Dead app. Thank you so much.
Thank you both, and thank you for what you do. I wish I could have interviewed you. I'm going to do it on the God's Not Dead app, so your turn's coming.
I'll look forward to it.
It was
Take care.
wonderful.
Use the code podcast10 to get a 10% discount on a full evaluation at amenclinics.com or on our supplements at brainmdhealth.com. Thank you for listening to the Brain Warriors Way podcast. Go to iTunes and leave a review, and you'll automatically be entered into a drawing to get a free signed copy of the Brain Warriors Way and the Brain Warriors Way cookbook we give away every month.